I think we could probably get started, Andrew. What do you think?
Yeah, are there other people in it? Sorry,
Yeah.
I can't see that. Oh, okay. Sorry, I was used to Zoom with like all the faces and everything. Perfect. All right. Cool. Well, hi. My name is Andrew Nicklawsky. I work for the Biostatistics component of the BBSR. And today I'm going to give a shorter talk about cost and consequences. I like to call the Jane Austen approach to economic analysis. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about cost effectiveness analysis, which I find to be a pretty fascinating marriage between statistics and health policy. This is meant to be like a pretty brief intro to some key concepts and terms for those who have never heard of this type of analysis before. So hopefully you can learn a bit more about this. All right, let's get this thing going. All right, so as Jane Austen once famously said, it's a truth universally acknowledged that a single person in possession of statistical knowledge must be in want of cost-effectiveness analysis. You might not have directly heard this quote because cost-effectiveness is a highly in-demand analysis form anywhere outside of the US. But with that, for those who came to this presentation because their passion for British landed gentry, this is pretty much the extent of my title's joke to pull in users. So if you want to hear about that, feel free to exit the presentation now. So before we talk about cost effectiveness analysis, we have to talk about economic evaluations in general. So economic evaluations are the comparative analysis of an alternative course of action in terms of both their costs and consequences. So cost effectiveness analysis is a type of economic evaluation. So just broadly, economic evaluation usually entails these kind of four things, which are alternative courses of action. So either a health intervention like a screening program, new ways of delivering care, new medications, new imaging technologies, can also be like intensity of dosage or a screening frequency. It also needs to have a comparative analysis. It's always a comparison. So it's either like things like the current way of doing things versus the old or new ways, old drugs versus new drugs, new imaging technology versus old imaging technology, and often clinical trials and stuff, a valid alternative could just be to do nothing. So usually could be comparing to usual care. Then we also need to have costs involved, which often are monetary units. And then finally, we need our consequences, which are outcomes either measured in natural units, such as cases averted or detected, years of life gained. It can be years of life gained combined with a quality measure, if you've ever heard of a QALY, or quality adjusted life year, or even just dollars. Often benefits, consequences, outcomes, and effectiveness can mean the same thing when I'm not talking about cost-effective analysis, but sometimes they don't. So just, it can be a little confusing. So now you have these four elements, but what's the purpose? Why would we do this? Well, the answer is we want to inform decision makers about efficient allocation of resources. If anybody took Econ 101, we all know that resources are scarce, and economic evaluations provide a way for us to systematically think about the costs and consequences of different interventions. So ultimately, what we're trying to do is derive value. And a kind of silly way to represent this would be, we're talking about beer. So value in economic evaluations has a pretty precise meaning. It's a comparison of incremental costs versus incremental benefits. So for example, say you want to pay $3 extra for a craft beer versus a Coors Light or something. An economic evaluation is thinking, is the extra additional benefit in terms of the taste, the satisfaction, or posting on it on Instagram greater than just $3? So is it worth the extra $3? So when we talk about an economic analysis, there's some key elements that we need to consider and when we're doing this analysis. So one would be the analytical perspective or point of view analysis. So we need to establish who's incurring the costs and consequences of these interventions. So this can either be the provider on the scale of a health department, it can be a societal, it can be an insurance company. Usually the consequences or outcomes apply to patients when we're talking about healthcare. Then another really important element is the time horizon. So we need to specify how long this analysis is looking at. Is it looking at the short term over days, or is it looking at a long term, like a whole lifespan? We also need to take into account discounting, which kind of depends on our time preference, because the benefit or cost now is not the same as the benefit or cost 30 years in the future or in the past. And this isn't so much due to inflation as much as opportunity costs. Then we also need to usually perform sensitivity analysis because we want to know how uncertain we are in our data's outcomes. And then some of the methods that we can use are simple aggregation of costs and benefits. We can use decision trees, or we can use more fun statistical things like Markov models, which are something I'll get to a little later. So let's talk specifically about cost-effective analysis in the context of economic evaluation. The objective of a cost-effective analysis is to compare the costs and benefits of two or more alternatives. So like we've already established, for a cost-effectiveness analysis, the benefits themselves are measured in natural units. So our effectiveness measures need to be something that's relevant and important, and our results need to be presented as incremental cost per unit of outcome. So how do we represent this outcome? Well, we use something called the ICER, which is our presented in this formula. It's essentially just the incremental cost over the incremental effect. So it represents the average incremental cost associated with one additional unit of the measure of effect. Some things to take into account here. There's really no reference value associated with this measure of benefit. So we need to make a determination ourselves what's considered to be good. And then also, you can only compare alternatives in which the natural benefit is the same. Like if you've heard the phrase, you have to compare apples to apples, oranges to oranges. It doesn't make sense if we don't have the same, same benefits. So I'm going to throw one more term at you because sometimes it matters to people in textbooks, but technically today I'm talking about a very specific form of cost effectiveness analysis called cost utility analysis. It's the same objective where we're comparing the cost and consequence of two or more alternatives, but it's a special case. Often it's almost used interchangeably though. The benefits in this case are specifically measured in quality adjusted life years, or QALYs. A quality combines both the gains and extra years of life, which are quantity, with the quality of those gains. And I'll talk a little more about it in a second. In a cost utility analysis, you can compare more alternatives because most health interventions have the goal of extending life, and life years gained is a pretty relevant outcome. One of the limitations though is not all measures of benefits are easily measured in QALYs. For instance, if you think of an intervention that promotes breastfeeding, there's not really a way to quantify that in terms of quality of life. And you don't really have a lot of choices other than making a bunch of simulations and a bunch of different assumptions, which really makes your results questionable. So speaking specifically about qualities, basically what they are is a number between 0 and 1 that reflects how people feel about life in that condition. So the lower the quality, the lower that number. So suppose that you have an intervention that increases your life expectancy by 10 years, but the quality of the extra years is not that great. We want to be able to adjust those extra years to account for the poor quality of life. So we do quality of life by life years. So specifically, let's say we're talking about a disease that has an intervention that keeps you bedridden. So you say that my quality of life, living out of my bed, not being able to do things, having people take care of me, is 0.15 on a scale of 0 to 1. So the quality adjusted life year, even though you're living 10 extra years on this intervention, is really only 1.5 years. This measure is pretty simple in essence, but as you can see, there will be a lot of controversy surrounding it, primarily due to how accurately it assesses conditions, since people judge things differently. The way that you come up with this measure is using surveys to elicit preferences. Like one common one is EQ5D, if you've heard of that. It's basically it asks people how many years you would be willing to give up to be avoid confined to bed in this case. So now that we've talked about cost effectiveness analysis, what components it has, the measure of effectiveness using qualities, let's talk about the outcome, which is the ICER. So we know the numerator is incremental cost and the denominator is incremental quality, but how do you actually interpret this product? Well, you can break it down into 4 cases, 2 of which are easy and 2 are more of a gray area where you have to use a little more thought. So in the 2 easy cases, if you have 2 interventions, an alternative B to usual care A, if B is more expensive and less effective, B is dominating A. So we prefer A, and this is most likely going to be obvious. There's not an economic evaluation done in this case. The other easy case is if B is less expensive and more effective. We know right off the bat we're going to prefer B to A. The harder cases are when B is more expensive but more effective, or B is both less expensive and less effective. So where B is more expensive and more effective, we have to ask, how do we know that the extra benefit is worth the extra costs? In the case where it's less expensive and less effective, we have to ask, how do we know if the cost savings are worth the reduced effectiveness? And you can interpret these less easy cases by using the implicit notion of value. So the key is to know what we're giving up and how we value. And in this case, there's the notion of opportunity costs, which is the loss of potential gain from other alternatives when one alternative is shown. So when we think about this, there's a notion internally of a threshold value. So to kind of put this in context, say you're trying to decide whether you want to get an MS or a PhD. With the MS, you have less years of education, so maybe quicker access to the job market, but also you might be trading off a lower ceiling through what you can achieve. Or if you're thinking more like materialistically, what if you wanted to buy last year's ski boots versus this year's ski boots? You might be saving some money buying last year's ski boots, but the new year's model has some new features or something. And then you have to ask yourself, are these enough changes to just justify this extra cost? So when you're thinking about these situations internally, there has to be some sort of threshold that's crossed that helps us decide what choice to make. So when we talk about cost effectiveness, we can represent this on a X and Y axis. So you can see on our x-axis, we have effectiveness, and our y-axis is cost. And then we have 4 different quadrants depending on those easy or not so easy situations. So in the first quadrant, the new treatment is more effective, but it's also more costly. In the second quadrant, our old treatment dominates because the new treatment is less effective and it's more costly. In the third quadrant, we have our new treatment being less costly but less effective. And then our fourth treatment, the new treatment dominates because it is more effective and less costly. So these two are our easy cases, and this is where we need to use our threshold. So typically we make decisions based off of a willingness to pay threshold. So in the case of cost effectiveness, our decision is made by if the ICER is less than this willingness to pay threshold. And interestingly, in the US, generally this accepted measurement metric is $150,000 per quality adjusted life year. So just kind of where did this number come from? It seems a little arbitrary. Well, like a lot of things, it apparently came from nowhere. There's rumors that it came from Medicare's decision to approve end-stage renal disease coverage in the 1970s. So the ICER for dialysis was about 50K per quality. And so in doing that, the government tacitly decided that 50K per quality was worth it, providing some sort of endorsement. But that seems to be more urban legend. Honestly, it just seems to be cited so often that that's just kind of become the standard. However, this has been confirmed through using these surveys to reveal the preferences of citizens in the US. And it seems that people in the US generally accept a range between $110,000 and $160,000 per quality adjusted life year. Just something to notice here, the ratio of 2 negative numbers is positive. So the ratios in quadrant 3 and quadrant 1 are both going to be similar, but they'll have completely different meanings, which is why it's important when you're interpreting your results and writing your paper, you need to provide context to where these numbers came from and show all the surrounding data. Otherwise, if you just present the ICER, that's a misleading fact there. So I've thrown a bunch of jargon at you. Let's put it in more specific context so that it makes a little more sense. If we're talking about just 2 arbitrary interventions, one that costs $7,000, the other costs $10,000, and we say that the quality adjusted life years for one is 0.4 and the second intervention is 0.42. If we just strictly took the average, the cost over the effect, we get $17,500 for intervention 1 and $23,810 for intervention 2. Naively, if we just consider the difference in averages, we see that it's 6,310. But this is the wrong way to think about it, because what we're really trying to do is discover the incremental cost versus the incremental benefits. But we don't care if the average cost per our effect is this and what the difference is. We want to know what's the additional benefit from intervention 2 versus intervention 1. So don't do that. That's not the way to do it. So like I said, we're trying to interested in deciding between alternatives. We don't care if the cost per unit of effectiveness in one alternative is less than the other. What really matters is incremental cost justifies incremental benefit. So now if we look at this example in the correct context, we see that we can calculate an ICER of 150,000 per quality adjusted life year. So we take the difference in our cost over the difference in effect. So just to hammer it home, 150,000 is a lot more than 6,300. And what's the problem? Where'd that come from? Like I keep saying, the relevant decision is whether we carry out intervention 2 versus intervention 1. So we're trying to say, does this extra cost, 3,000, justify the extra benefit, 0.02 years? So the average cost per unit of benefit is not informative, and it's not the relevant comparison. Like I said, this only provides, it's $3,000 more, but it only provides 0.02 in effect. So that's a lot of money to gain just a little effect. And in real life, this happens a lot. So it's not difficult to come up with examples. I just don't know a lot of different drug names. So now I've kind of talked about the conceptual background, some of the things that we do to get the numbers. Let's talk about the stat stuff. So I mentioned earlier that Markov models are a way to perform a cost of effectiveness analysis. And the reason is due to the fact that there's uncertainty surrounding the estimated costs and qualities, we can say the ICER itself becomes an expected value. And then we know that time is money, so we want to take that into account. So the Markov model is used to randomly, itself is used to model randomly changing systems. In our context, we want to take into account time when thinking about these interventions. So we want to use a Markov model to define different health states, such as being ill or dead, getting relief or no relief, headache or no headache. In doing so, will allow people to transition from one health state to another. And we assign a probability to these transitions, either using data from a clinical trial or observational study. And then we want to take into account the fact that these transitions happen over time, because the time is money, and call this a cycle. So essentially what we get is each health state has a cost or benefit associated with it. And we can make a nice model like this. So this is an older example about HIV. We have 4 different states here. In the first state, our CD4 count is from 200 to 500, which would be considered the best. In health state B, CD4 count is less than 200, which isn't so great. State C is having AIDS, which is bad. And death is our state 4, which is also not a great result. So in this model, we're comparing 2 different therapies, monotherapy versus combination therapy. And I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to pronounce those drugs. In this case, we'll consider cycle length to be a year. And using this information, we can illustrate all states and possible transitions. So just when you're looking at these arrows, we can see that we can go from our state A to death. We can go to B, which is a reduced CD4 count, or we can get AIDS. Similarly, we can get from AIDS, we can only die. So these arrows represent the states that we can go to. And some of these arrows point to themselves because, like for instance, with death, it's considered an absorbing state. There's no way to return from death that we know so far. And people who are dead stay dead. So the other thing is, like I said, this is an old example, so it is possible to return from AIDS, but like I said, this is an older example. So now that we have that visualization, we can kind of give numbers to those different transitions. So for instance, in monotherapy, our probability of staying in that state is 0.75, whereas our probability of transitioning from state C to death is 0.25. So I just gave the number for this and the number for this. And some things to notice are in this example, our combination therapy has better results than our monotherapy. So for instance, state A, you're more likely to stay in state A in combination therapy. You're less likely in state A to transition to state B, or more likely to stay in state B. And the same thing, kind of descending. Once again, something to notice is that death is an absorbing state. So once you're in death, there's no way to get out of it because these probabilities all add up to 1. You need to cover all options. There's no way for you to go anywhere outside of these health states. And again, mentioned these kind of things can be derived from clinical trials, observational studies, and so on. So now that we have our transition probabilities, we need to assign rewards to each state. In this example, our monotherapy cost, we'll say, is about $2,278, where our combination cost is $4,364. We also need to take into account a lot of other things. So in this case, it's pretty simple. We're just going to take into account healthcare and community costs. So for these different states, healthy, we say that the burden is $2,756, whereas the reduced health state is $3,052, having AIDS is $9,007, and dying is free. So keep in mind that these costs are per cycle, in which case we specified to be in year. So now that we have our rewards and our transition probabilities, we can actually solve the model. For this model, remember we have to pick a time horizon. So in this example, I guess I didn't give the actual results, but theoretically we're choosing 20 years because this is a lifetime for an AIDS cohort. We can calculate our costs by multiplying the number of people in each health state by the corresponding costs. So you can see we're simulating 1,000 people starting out because everybody starts healthy. And each cycle, each year, we see that in the first year, 721 people remain in state A based off of that transition probability. 202 go to state B, 67 go to state C, and 10 are deceased. In our next cycle, we apply those transition probabilities again and get in year 2, 520 people in state A, 263 in state B, 181 in state C, 36 in state D. So for each of these, like I said in the previous slide, we have our cost per state, which will be multiply them, and then we would have two different models, one for combination therapy, one for monotherapy, which we would multiply since those are two different costs associated there. Then we can also calculate the life years for each cycle. So we add the people alive. So discounting the people in the death state, we would, for cycle 2, we'd get 520 plus 263 plus 181 to get our life years. And then at the end of 20 cycles, we add up our life years and our costs, and that's it. Which seems pretty simple, but there's a lot that goes into this. One of the last things we need to do, though, is to adjust for quality of life. So, like I said, we're talking about quality adjusted life years. So there's a preference associated with being in every state. So we take these life years in each state and multiply it by that preference association so that we can get our quality adjusted life years. Then we'll have our qualities for different inventions, their costs, and we can calculate our overall ICER. And like I said, I made this seem pretty simple, straightforward, but there's really a lot of nuance and background legwork in determining the costs, the qualities, the health states. You know, you have to make sure that it's comprehensive. You have to make sure that you're taking everything into account. You have to make sure that you're justifying any of the assumptions that you make, because you want this to be applicable to whatever population you're speaking to. Some other things that can happen is you might want to take into account a half cycle correction, because if the people that died from this state and went to this state, we're not taking into account any of the costs there. We're just giving them zero. So a half cycle correction would allow you to apply a uniform distribution over that death, or over that time period, excuse me, and so that you can incur some of those costs before they transition to death. The other thing you might want to take into account is background mortality, because things happen to people outside of unfortunately experiencing AIDS. And you also notice Markov models have a memory process. So the transition from state A to state B, it doesn't matter how long they stayed in state A, which isn't necessarily true in real life. And you can fix this by adding additional health states or making conditional probabilities. But as you can see, it can get pretty complicated quick. So now that we have our ICER, we want to determine how confident we can be in our results. And the problem with cost-effective analysis is we often can't do traditional statistical analyses because we don't have individual patient data. So to understand the influence of model inputs, we must use simulation. So generally there's two different approaches, which are either deterministic, which be to choose one value from our parameters and keep everything else constant and vary that, or probabilistic, where we'd assign probability distributions to all the parameters and use simulation. So first we'll talk about deterministic, because that's pretty easy. So once again, let's talk about our HIV example. And let's say we're changing the relative risk between mono and combination therapy. So if we just plot our expected cost per person versus our relative risk using everything else keeping the same, as you can notice, if we have a lower relative risk, which in turn affects our transition probabilities, we actually have people staying in health states that are more costly because we're saying that combo therapy is more effective. So you can see, maybe as you would expect or as you don't expect, that actually it's more expensive to have this combo therapy being more effective. However, that's not the point of our analysis. We're trying to take this with respect to ICER. So we need to take into account those quality adjusted life years. So the ICER will show us that there's a little more nuance with those results because there's more moving parts. So while our more effective drug increases costs, it also isn't increasing our life expectancy. So the less effective combo therapy becomes more similar to monotherapy, but the costs keep going up. So as they become similar, the ICER becomes higher, whereas when it's lower, we have a lower ICER. So with that information, we can vary our parameters over a realistic range and create a nice visual representation, which is called a tornado diagram. So what this is showing is for varying each of these parameters individually, holding everything else constant. These would be the extremes for our ICER that we would see. And what this can do is help us identify what parameters in our model have a lot of effect on our results, so that can either tell us maybe we need to consider this more, or maybe we have an issue there. And like in this case, obviously age has a huge effect on the ICER. And I don't think this is still the AIDS example, because now we're in Australian dollars. But anyways, the other important thing to note is we should have a line here, which is what we predetermine to be our willingness to pay threshold. So we can show what causes the ICER values to fall below that versus what causes the ICER values to come above that. So that kind of helps us isolate individual variables. Now let's say we want to talk about how confident we are in our ICER estimate overall. Well, we can do probabilistic analysis. So instead of changing one parameter at a time, we're going to vary all of them simultaneously. So what we do is we determine logical distributions for each parameter and sample from them, say doing like 10,000 Monte Carlo draws. And we'll plot those on our cost effectiveness plane. And what we're hoping to see is a group of them in one of these quadrants. Because if we have no discernible grouping and it's all 4 quadrants, then we know there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding our result, because we're not sure whether it's in one of these really easy to determine situations or in one of the ones where we need to use our threshold. So when you're presenting these results, we're going to use our willingness to pay threshold, and we're going to determine what proportion of those draws end up above it and below it, so we can give a percentage of the time that our ICER is more or less than our willingness to pay threshold. So essentially what this probabilistic sensitivity analysis is trying to mimic is frequentist statistical inference. And as you can see, then with our percentages, we can plot over different willingness to pay thresholds depending on what we would determine to be good or what we decide we want to use, and see how that influences our results as well. So in this example, we have our, as our willingness, we increase our willingness to pay threshold, we can see that the intervention actually becomes more cost effective for the control once we hit this threshold, whereas before, actually the control itself is the more cost effective option. So while this is not necessarily ideal way to approach it, it does lend support, because that means that even if we misspecified our assumed parameters, we can have a certain degree of confidence in our results. So in conclusion, cost effectiveness is a really interesting tool that can help guide decisions, and it has a pretty broad application. In a lot of other parts of the world, like England, it's a fundamental feature for helping them make decisions for selecting treatments, because it's paid for by the government. So everything requires cost-effective analysis. Unfortunately, in the US, we can't make decisions through that because it's kind of a boogeyman. It's associated with the idea of death panels and assigning value to lives. But realistically, that's something we do every day. I mean, when you're buckling your seatbelt, you're making a conscious decision to improve your life that way. Or when you're going to the store during the COVID pandemic, you're saying that your risk is worth it to go buy groceries, or maybe not buy groceries. But anyways, cost effectiveness analysis itself doesn't have to be a bad thing, and it can be extremely beneficial. So that in the context of cancer, for instance, I think the cost of new treatments are becoming pretty expensive. So, and we can't just ignore these results, especially when we're talking about incremental gains in care, or talking about quality of life, which really matters in cancer treatment. So while we'd like to do whatever it takes to save lives and improve care, sometimes the crippling economic impact it can have on a person is equally devastating, or to their family, particularly when in a case where it doesn't translate to that much benefit, which is where cost effectiveness analysis can be a really nice tool. I just want to say thank you to Marcelo. He's the director of one of the co-directors of the Population Health Share Resource. I learned all of this from taking his wonderful class at unfortunately, I don't think you can take anymore. And it really helped me do a publication on this. And I think it's been really interesting, and I hope more people are interested in doing this kind of analysis. So thank you for listening to my talk.
Hey, Andrew, that was great. That was really interesting. Michael, how do questions work with the attendees? I'm not sure if the attendees can just unmute themselves. You can throw a question in chat if you have one, but I had one in the meantime. I was wondering how often you're able to use kind of these cost effectiveness techniques in your current position. Like, do they come up with clinical trial design or any other types of projects you're working on?
So yeah, I can't speak to that in general, because this is something I recently learned about, and I found to be pretty fascinating. Like I said, it's not something that's necessarily commonly done in the U.S. But for example, the paper that I helped work on, we looked at a few different combination therapies for treating cancer, and we did a comparative analysis to see, which provided the most incremental gain, and it was really interesting because we got some pretty clear results. So that's where it's coming from my work. I've had an experience of publishing one paper, and like I said, I hope that this talk or people becoming more aware of this type of analysis, there might be more interest in doing that, because I think it is really fascinating, and it's good to take into account the costs and the quality of life when you're looking at these new cancer treatments.
Yeah, I think that would be really interesting. I still don't know how questions work, but we're not getting any in chat. So
as okay, I'll just assume that I did a good job. But I mean, if people, I don't know if people have questions. I can't really see a lot, but if they do, feel free to email me, and I can try to answer them the best I can, or direct them to resources where they can find things.
Okay.
Oh, all right. No, not a question, but we did get a compliment.
Positive comment. Yeah, that's good.
I like that. That's nice.
Okay, well, I think we can call it there then.